Okay, so we're back to. Oh, hello.
Good morning.
Morning. Just started the stream. So we're back to Thomas Taylor on Aristotle's philosophy. We're on Aristotle's idea of the wholeness of water and the role of the ocean in that regard. So I think we read footnote 4 here last time from Olympiodorus. We'll go ahead and reread that possibly and then get back to the text from the long quote from Aristotle. So, footnote 4. Aristotle now investigates whether the sea is the wholeness of water, and he shows that it is through four arguments, the first of which is as follows. The other elements have wholenesses, to which, aspiring, they tend. It is not reasonable, therefore, to suppose that water alone has not a wholeness, but if water has a wholeness, we must investigate what it is. It is, therefore, by no means rivers, for it is adapted to a wholeness to be continued, but rivers are not continued, for they have not a collected body of water. Hence, rivers are not the wholeness of water, but the sea as being continued and having water collected together and not separated. And here we may observe that from this dogma of Aristotle it follows that the sea is not continued and not divided, is continued and not divided as geographers assert it to be. And if it should be said that seas are not continued but divided from each other, we reply that it is not absurd that the parts of the sea should be in other places, because all things are in all. Okay, so he in befores, well, if it should happen that the empirical fact contradicts Aristotle here, it still wouldn't be damaging to the theory. Thus, though the wholeness of fire is in the inflammable matter, and this is Olympiodorus's reasoning, it does seem pretty weak. Well, it shouldn't be surprising because all is in all. That seems a very kind of flippant, offhanded way of reconciling. Now, luckily for Aristotle, it is the case that the oceans are all connected. But thus, though the wholeness of fire is in the inflammable matter at the summit of the air, yet there are fountains of fire under the earth, because all things are in all. Again, it is not possible that rivers can be the wholeness of water, since they are fluent, but the sea is stable, and stability is adapted to a wholeness. The sea, therefore, on account of its stability, is the wholeness of all water, and not rivers. If, however, Aristotle has before said that the sea is fluent, yet is not fluent in the same way as rivers, for they flow elsewhere, viz. Into the sea, but the sea flows only into itself. Nor let it be said, Olympiodorus adds, that as the inflammable matter at the summit of the air, which is the wholeness of fire, is moved, there is not stability in a wholeness. So that's one way of arguing against that. But we saw this before, it moves in a circle, and that's as close to a stability as you can get. Next paragraph. The second argument is as follows. The sea is evidently the wholeness of water, since all river water, aspiring after its wholeness, happens or hastens into the sea, and things long to join their proper wholeness. So the third argument is this: the place which is the subject of water is the recipient of all water, both salt and potable, but the peculiarity of a wholeness is to receive the whole of water. If, however, it should be said, why does not the sea contain potable water? We reply that so far as pertains to the sea, it contains potable water, but that in consequence of the daily evaporation arising from the sun and moon and the other stars, it does not. So the sea in itself contains all types of water, but because of these other factors, salt predominates in the oceans. The fourth and last argument is as follows. The characteristic of water, as water, is to hasten into the most hollow place of the earth, and that this is the sea is evident, for all rivers hasten into it. Through these four arguments, Aristotle infers that the sea is the wholeness of water. Olympiodorus afterwards adduces certain doubts against this doctrine and offers and also solutions of the doubts as follows. Since all wholenesses are according to nature, but the sea is contrary to nature, for it is salt, the sea therefore is not the wholeness of water. To this it must be replied that the sea is not salt contrary to nature, for if this were the case, it would be sweet according to nature, but it has no taste. So skipping forward, another doubt is the following: seawater is contrary to nature, since to refrigerate and to moisten is the property of all water, but the sea does not produce these effects, for it heats and dries. And I don't know why that idea would even be there, that the sea heats, seawater makes things hot. I guess like if you were trying to drink it, it would not quench your thirst and it would make you feel hot. And therefore is not the wholeness of water. To this doubt we may reply that the sea does not heat and dry of itself, but from a fuliginous exhalation being conjoined with it. Again, it's kind of strange. Why do they have this empirical notion that seawater makes things hot and dry? It's really not totally clear to me. Maybe it could be that during the winter, warm air comes off of the sea and regulates the cold. Could be that. Afterwards, Aristotle converts himself to the third problem, in which he investigates the cause of the saltness of the sea, and he admits, indeed, the reason assigned for it by the ancient philosophers, not as simply the cause of the saltness of the sea, but as a concause of the things asserted by them. For they say that the sea is salt because the most attenuated part of it is daily evaporated from it by the sun, with which part the sun is nourished, and that feculent and salt part is left behind, which is, correct. Aristotle admits, therefore, that evaporation is the cause of the saltness of the sea, except that this is not the only cause, but also a fuliginous exhalation. Okay. And we're back, I think, right here. So Aristotle. But to inquire according to the ancient doubt, why so great a quantity of water is never apparent, since innumerable rivers, and of an immense magnitude, daily flow into the sea. And yet the sea does not become in any respect greater. Rivers always flow in, it doesn't get bigger. Why is that? To make this the subject of doubt is not indeed at all absurd, yet it will not be difficult for him to see the cause of this who considers the affair with attention. For the same quantity of water, when widely diffused and when collected, will not be dried in an equal time, but there will be so much difference that the latter will remain for a whole day, but the former, just as if any one should spread abroad the water in a bowl on a large table, will wholly disappear while the spectator is beholding it. And this also happens about rivers, for since all of them continually flow, the quantity of water which arrives at an immense and broad place becomes rapidly and invisibly dry. What, however, is written in the Phaedo about rivers and the sea is impossible, for it is there said that all the cavities which are under the earth have a communication with each other, and that what is called Tartarus is the principle and fountain of all water, this being a certain quantity of water about the middle, from which all flowing and stagnant water is derived. I hope Olympiodorus responds to this, because, it seems pretty obvious that this is a myth, meant to be interpreted mythically, but then, I think in the Cratylus commentary, or maybe the Timaeus commentary, Proclus seems to indicate that he takes Plato's geography totally seriously, like literally. So Proclus would want to defend this view then. And so let's see if Olympiodorus, following Proclus, does attempt to. So this being a certain quantity of water about the middle, from which all flowing and stagnant water is derived, that it also flows into each of the streams, because that which is the first and the principal perpetually fluctuates. Okay, for it has no seat, but it is always rolled about the middle. Right, the water fluctuates and leads to these different directions into different streams, being moved upward and downward, pours itself into the streams and rivers. That's Plato's account from the myth at the end of the Phaedo. That some of the streams of Tartarus also in many places become stagnant, as is the case with our sea, but that all of them are again circularly led back to the principle whence they began to flow, according to the same place, but some according to a place contrary in position to that from which they flowed. Thus, for instance, if they began to flow from beneath, they enter from above. That there is likewise a descent as far as to the middle, for the remaining course to all of them is in an ascending direction. That the that the taste and color also of the water is according to the quality of the earth through which it flows. Okay, so Olympiodorus, it looks like he is coming to Plato's defense. So let's see. Plato does not assert that Tartarus is the wholeness of water, as Aristotle says he does, who, as usual, confutes the apparent and not the real meaning of Plato's words. Simplicius, who is the biggest harmonizer of Plato and Aristotle, may say at one point that Aristotle intentionally confutes the apparent and not real meaning to give the appearance that he disagrees when he really agrees. And Olympiodorus is contemporary with Simplicius, so we would probably share that same doctrine. Okay, or maybe he's less of a conciliarist about this. For Plato asserts this fabulously. It is not okay, but unfortunately, then Proclus is left out to dry, who seems to take that same myth literally elsewhere. So Olympiodorus is not defending the Proclean view. For Plato asserts this fabulously. It is not fit, therefore, to receive physically what is asserted mythologically. But Plato, says Olympiodorus, asserts these things, obscurely signifying something else. For having demonstrated in the Phaedo, through 5 arguments, that the soul is immortal, he afterwards makes mention of the judicial places in Hades, viz. Tartarus, and Periphlagathon, Cocytus, and Acheron, so that Tartarus is not the wholeness of water, but of the places of judgment. Olympiodorus adds that what Plato says in the Phaedo about Tartarus is to be considered ethically and physically. Ethically, indeed, that Tartarus is a judicial place from which all the judicial places are derived, viz. Cocytus, Acheron, and Periphlagathon, into which souls are hurled according to their different offenses. Those souls that are perpetually punished, on account of their offenses being incurable, being hurled into Tartarus. Not that the soul is literally punished forever in Tartarus, since divinity does not punish the soul from anger, but in order to apply a remedy to its maladies. But we must say that the soul is punished perpetually, calling perpetuity its life and its partial period. For in reality, souls that have committed the greatest offenses cannot be sufficiently purified in one period, but are in life perpetually, as in Tartarus, which period Plato calls eternity. So I guess the idea there could be harmonized with what Proclus says about measuring time. So souls measure perpetuity. The world soul kind of measures all perpetuity at once, and then there's a given kind of length of the measure of time for each soul. So to say that you are perpetually in Tartarus then is to say that you're in Tartarus for one entire cycle of your soul. Sort of the equivalent of the great year concept in the cosmos. So in the microcosm of the individual, you could be stuck in Tartarus for, not just for one period of your soul's ability to measure time, but for the entirety of that period. It is requisite, however, not to be ignorant that the eternal is one thing and the perpetual another. For the eternal is the whole. So he's just saying when Plato calls it eternity, he's really referring to perpetuity, and when he says perpetuity, he means that in a metaphorical and limited sense. But Plato will use common language at sometimes and then technical language when he clarifies. For the eternal is the whole, as a whole now or instant, deprived of the past and future time, and wholly subsisting in the present abiding now. But the perpetual is that which indeed always subsists, but is surveyed in the 3 times, past, present, and future. Hence we call divinity eternal, in consequence of not having his being in time, but possessing it through the whole of time, past, present, and future, as a present now. For this is the nature of the eternal. but we do not call him perpetual, since he has not his being in time. If, therefore, we call matter perpetual, it must be said that it is so, as being invested with form in time, and again receiving other forms, those that were prior being corrupted. So matter is only perpetual insofar as it receives a succession of forms. In itself, it's not even perpetual, because matter, being formless, doesn't receive the quantitative nature of time, presumably. So matter is sort of like an inverse eternity, insofar as it partakes of form. It's perpetual, not eternal. In itself, it's like sub-eternal or something, whereas the forms in themselves are eternal, always energizing. Matter is eternal, never energizing, or something. Hence, we may not only interpret Tartarus ethically, but also physically, by saying that Tartarus is matter, in consequence of the tumult and sedition of contrary natures which exist in it. Okay, interesting. So if Olympiodorus's physical interpretation of Tartarus as matter is good, then that implies some connection between the place of judgment and matter, which, if this is the soul's death, life in the body is the soul's death, then there's probably some valid connection there. All right. But when Plato in the Phaedo says that of the rivers which are derived from Tartarus, some, having proceeded to a small extent, again return into it through the same. I'm going to sneeze 1 second. All right. Okay, so in the Phaedo, Plato says that of the rivers which are derived from Tartarus, some, having proceeded to a small extent, again return into it through the same place from whence they flowed. So they ebb and flow a small distance, but that others, proceeding to the greatest extent, no longer return to Tartarus through the same place whence they began to flow, but again making a period according to a place contrary in position to that from which they proceeded. This considered, okay, so those flows of from matter, which is interesting. How does he reconcile that with that idea of Tartarus? So these considered ethically signify that souls whose offenses are difficult to be cured, or which are incurable, do not even for a little recede from generation, i.e. from Tartarus, which generation is given to them as a punishment. Okay, so now he's treating Tartarus as synonymous with generation, which is even more consistent with this idea that life in this world is the death of the soul, and we are being punished here, being brought into the world of generation like we are. So footnote, the reader must remember that by generation, the whole of a visible nature is signified, as opposed to an incorporeal and invisible nature. Generation here being the world of generation, not generation in the sense that generation preceded the cosmos, where you're talking about that indefinite state of matter. So the world of generation as the sublunary world is given them as a punishment, and they don't move from it in order that they may be purified. So they spend a long time in generation to purify themselves. But even though they appear to recede from it through the dissolution of the body, yet they again return into generation in another body. So trapped in samsara. And those offending souls are easily cured who are not very much attached to Tartarus, i.e. to generation. Okay, so the rivers that barely move from Tartarus are like those highly materially invested souls that are in generation for a long period to purify themselves. And then there are others that go far away and don't return through the same gate back into Tartarus, but through other channels. So there are other others that are easily cured, not very much attached to Tartarus degeneration, hence, after proceeding from, they do not immediately hasten to it, but for certain long periods of time remain without generation. According to a certain period, however, they again come into generation for the sake of being purified from their former offenses. So, Proclus 2 will treat it as basically inevitable that these souls go through a kind of cycle up into immaterial existence and then down into material existence, although that's probably qualified at some level. Let's see. Some YouTube chats. Right, so the book is just Thomas Taylor on Aristotle's philosophy. If you Google it, it's public domain, so you can find it. Okay. So Olympiodorus and Proclus and others, and Plato arguably, treats the soul's journey as kind of inevitably cyclical. You're always going to go back down. You're going to have some offense after some period, which doesn't necessarily imply a denial of free will, because it's always your choice. There could just be a certain tendency after a long period of time. It becomes more and more likely that you'll go through some kind of sin, and then purification eventually will be necessary. And if we're dealing with infinite spans of time, because the soul is immortal, then it becomes basically a statistical necessity that you have this cycle. Okay. And such is the ethical explanation. But the physical is as follows. Again, Tartarus is generation and matter, and the rivers signify physically the corruption of a natural thing is produced, either from the imbecility inherent in that which is corrupted, in the same manner as the flame of a lamp. For this, being enfeebled from the failure of nutriment, is extinguished, or it is produced from the dominion of a contrary nature. So physical corruption happens when you don't have the power to sustain yourself, or you're dominated by something else which is stronger. Here, therefore, through the rivers, which immediately again return to Tartarus, the corruption of a natural thing from itself is signified. But through the rivers which proceed in a contrary direction into Tartarus, the corruption from contraries is signified. Okay, interesting. So there's two forms of corruption, Tartarus being matter itself. You return, like pure matter is the absolute dissolution of form. So you go into corruption from a feebleness, ebbing and flowing just a little ways, or you go out and encounter some change to the contrary and then are corrupted because of that. So that makes sense. Lastly, when Plato says that the taste and color of the water is according to the quality of the earth through which it flows, this signifies that souls in which reason does not preside as a charioteer are changed according to the subject temperament of the body. Okay. So, water, color and taste of the water is influenced by the quality of the earth, and so souls in which reason does not preside as charioteer are changed according to the subject temperament of the body. For when reason has dominion, the soul does not yield to the temperament of the body. It would be interesting to cross-reference that with Plotinus Ennead 3.6, which we're reading now, and one of the other groups that is not live streamed. You can join that by going to patreon.com/emorwoll and joining the reading groups. But that tractate is on the impassibility of immaterial things. So soul is supposed to be impassible. So how is it that the soul takes on the temperament of the body? Olympiodorus allows for that possibility, and Plotinus does in a qualified way, but it's never going to be that the soul is directly affected by the body. The soul instead will itself be the active party at all times. And we have to kind of jump through some hoops um, to get the soul to be affected. Of course, it can be affected by the immaterial reason principles inherent in body. So you have the irrational reason principles, and then you have genuine logos that reason can be directed towards. So when the higher reason fails, you can be swayed, the soul can be swayed by irrational reason principles, which is not the same as being directly affected by the body. But, yep, we get this interpretation of the rivers. So let's go back. All right. Okay, so Aristotle. If this, however, were the case, and let's get the text again. So, right, he's going through Plato's account in the Phaedo myth, and now he's going to try to refute Plato, interpreting Plato literally, of course. If this, however, were the case, it would happen that rivers would not always flow to the same place, for since they flow into the middle, from which also they originally flowed, they will no more flow from beneath than from above, but they will flow to whatever part fluctuating Tartarus tends. Though if this happened, that which they say would come to pass, viz., that rivers would flow upward, which is impossible. Farther still, whence will the water originate which is generated, and which again flows upward? I mean, one physical interpretation is that the upward flowing waters are springs, which, which do flow upward. But Aristotle has addressed fountains elsewhere already. So I guess he's just bracketing that and not including that in rivers. Farther still, whence will the water originate which is generated, and which again flows upward? For it is necessary to exempt the whole of this, if the equal is always to be preserved, since as much as flows externally will again flow to the principle. All rivers, however, which do not flow into others are seen to end in the sea, but no one is seen to end in the earth. For though they disappear, yet they again emerge. But those rivers become great which flow to a great extent through a cavity, for they receive the streams of many rivers, the courses of which they intercept in place and length. Hence the Ister and the Nile are the greatest of the rivers which enter into the sea. And I'm curious what the Ister, which river that is, may refer to the Danube. You would expect that. Probably the Danube. Okay, hence the Ister and the Nile are the greatest of the rivers which enter into the sea, and about the fountains of rivers different persons assign different causes of each, because many run into the same river. It is, however, evident that all these things cannot happen, especially since the sea also would have its origin from thence. That the place, therefore, in which the sea is contained is the place of water, and not of the sea alone, and from what cause potable water is immanifest, except when it flows, but another part of water is permanent, and why the sea is rather the end than the beginning of water, just as in animated bodies, excrement is the end of all nutriment, and especially of that which is moist, so much has been said by us. Okay. So, chapter 12. We'll just keep going here. So what is this topic? This is Taylor. The next thing that particularly demands our attention is the philosophy of Aristotle, or in the philosophy of Aristotle, is his admirable doctrine concerning the soul. But as the treatise in which this doctrine is contained is remarkably obscure, I shall incorporate in this chapter the substance of the introduction to it, which accompanies my translation of that treatise. Okay, so he himself wrote an introduction, and he's going to incorporate from himself from that introduction. So if he's true to his own style, he's probably just taking large sections of his own writing now and pasting them in. In order, therefore, to understand the dogmas of Aristotle respecting the soul, it is necessary to speak in the first place of the powers of the soul, and show in how many ways they are divided, and what appellation each of them is allotted. In the next place, it is requisite to enumerate the opinions of the ancients respecting these powers, and in the third place to unfold from division the true opinion concerning them. In the first place, then, psychical powers, or powers belonging to the soul, receive a twofold division. For some of them are rational, but others irrational, and each of these powers is again divided in a twofold respect. For of the rational powers, some are vital and orectic, or pertaining to appetites, but others are gnostic. Okay, so there are appetitive rational powers, not just appetite is not just irrational. In a similar manner, also, the irrational powers are divided. Okay, so I guess what they're saying is that there are rational and vital, and rational and gnostic, and irrational and vital, and irrational and gnostic. Again, the rational and gnostic powers of the soul receive a triple division. So one out of the four categories we just drew itself is divided into three. For one of them is opinion, another is dianoia, and another is intellect. Opinion, therefore, is conversant with the universal which is in sensibles, since it has a knowledge of this. Okay, so yeah, opinion, pistis, deals with sensible objects, so sensible bodies. It knows only the universal because only universals can be known. Particulars or pure particulars cannot be known. So opinion knows the universal in the sensible. For it knows that every man is a biped, and knows all color is the object of sight alone. And farther still, it knows the conclusions of the dianoetic energy, but has no knowledge of the causes of these conclusions. So like syllogisms lead to propositions, which then opinion can judge and compare to empirical experience, but opinion doesn't know the syllogistic process itself, or the logical operations. For it knows that the rational soul is immortal, but it does not know why it is immortal, because this is the province of dianoia. But it is the province of opinion to know only that it is immortal. And that's an interesting way of breaking that down also. Opinion knows that things are. Dianoia knows why things are. Hence, opinion is that power which knows the universal insensibles and the conclusions of the dianoetic energy. Whence also opinion is well defined in the Sophist of Plato to be the termination of dianoia. Right? For the dianoetic power, syllogizing that the rational soul is immortal, opinion, receiving this conclusion, only knows that the soul is immortal. But dianoia is that power which completes, as it were, a certain path by passing from propositions to conclusions, that from which also it derives its appellation through thinking. Thus, for instance, dianoia investigates whence it is that the rational soul is immortal. Afterwards, beginning from things more manifest, it passes on to the object of investigation and says that soul is self-motive. That which is self-motive is always moved, but this is immortal. Soul, therefore, is immortal. And this is the employment of dianoia. Hence it is the discursive or evolved energy of reason, and when unperverted, is that power of the soul which reasons scientifically, deriving the principles of its reasoning from intellect. But the employment of intellect, properly so called, is to apply itself to things by simple projections, and in a way superior to demonstration. For as sense, by its projecting energy, when it meets with something white, or some particular figure, has a knowledge of it superior to demonstration, since it is not in want of syllogism in order to perceive that this thing is white, but it knows that it is by simple projection. Thus also intellect knows intelligibles by a simple application of its Gnostic power, in a manner superior to demonstration. Okay, so there's a parallel, both opinion that grasps the nature of sensibles, the universals inherent in sensibles, grasps them by an intuitive power or a simple projection. That's a good phrase to capture the idea of, intuitive knowledge, simple projection. So intellect, properly speaking, knows the principles of dianoia, knows, intelligibles by a simple projection. The energy of intellect, however, is alone present with those who have arrived at the summit of purification and science, and who, through the cathartic virtues, are accustomed to energize without imagination and sense. So this noetic intuition is not something that all of us automatically just have, or all of us, I'm sure, if you clarified, would have a semblance of it, but scientific intellectual projection is only possible when the soul itself has been purified, and an application of that is that only the true mathematician really grasps intuitively the necessary truth of axioms, and that's an application of a simple projection of that noetic energy. For intellect is, as it were, the most perfect habit of the soul, whence also Plotinus, speaking of this, says, quote, "He who energizes according to it will know what I say," because it is not possible to explain such an energy by words. But of these powers, intellect has the first order, and opinion the last, and dianoia ranks in the middle, the energy of which is appropriate to our soul, since it also possesses a middle order in the universe. So like Iamblichus, Taylor is saying that the soul essentially energizes dianoetically. It participates of intellect, and sense participates of dianoia, but dianoia is the kind of authentic level of soul. All right. Through this power, likewise, I mean the dianoetic power, our soul is elevated to the contemplation of intelligibles, which is the perfection of the soul. For since our soul is nourished with and allied to sensibles, it is impossible, in consequence of her association with the senses, that she can immediately elevate herself to the contemplation of intelligibles in immaterial forms. But at first she thinks that these also are bodies, and have magnitude, and other sensible properties. So we have a hard time thinking of pure intelligibles because we're so used to engaging in sense. Like in the Republic, the person who goes out of the cave and tries to perceive, it'll be hard for them to see because their eyes are accustomed to the shadows. Thus also Plato in the Phaedo says that this is the extremity of all evils, that if at any time we are at leisure from the attendance of the body, and wish to apply ourselves to the contemplation of divine natures, then, invading us on all sides in our investigations, it causes agitations and tumults, and so vehemently impels us that we are not able, through its presence, to perceive the truth. Okay. For the fantasy intervening induces us to think that a divine nature. I'm sorry, I was kind of spacing out. I'm going to read the last sentence again. All right, so if at any time we are at leisure from the attendance of the body, and wish to apply ourselves to the contemplation of divine natures, then, invading us on all sides in our investigations, it causes agitations and tumults, the sensible habit in us. So if we try to not attend to the body, all these sensible things come in and try to distract us, and so vehemently impels us that we are not able, through its presence, to perceive the truth. For the fantasy intervening, and fantasy is the faculty of imagination, And there's different like placements of the fantasy, exactly where that lies. I mean, somewhere between dianoia and sense, presumably, or that's either the same with ikasia, which is the imaging faculty, or above it. Aristotle calls it the passive intellect. So hopefully this Taylor will actually clarify for us exactly where the fantasy subsists. For the fantasy intervening induces us to think that a divine nature is corporeal and has magnitude and figure, and does not suffer us to form conceptions of divinity incorporeally and unattended with figure. On this account, it is necessary. So fantasy seems inferior to dianoia. I mean, certainly it is. But is it? It's probably inferior to opinion as well. So it's between opinion and this sensing faculty. That's where I would place it. Let me ask ChatGPT real quick. Just where do most Neoplatonists place the faculty of the fantasy in the epistemological hierarchy? It's generally considered an intermediary level within the epistemological hierarchy. Fantasia serves as the bridge between sense perception and the higher intellectual faculties, but it does not possess direct access to true knowledge or the intelligible realm. Instead, it is where images or impressions formed from sense data are stored, recombined, and presented to the mind. The epistemological hierarchy in Neoplatonic thought often follows a tiered structure, moving from the material to the spiritual, so sense perception, and then fantasy, and then dianoia. Let me ask specifically, how does it rank compared with opinion? It ranks somewhat closely to opinion, but they serve distinct functions, relate differently to knowledge. Both are situated below dianoia. And yeah, here ChatGPT is concluding opinion is a step above fantasia because it involves an evaluation or judgment. Okay. So pretty much where I placed it, I think, is where most Neoplatonists will place it. Okay, so does not suffer us to form conceptions of divinity incorporeally and unattended with figure. On this account, it is necessary that the soul, when proceeding to her perfection, should first energize according to the dianoetic power, from its being conversant with objects that have a middle situation between intelligibles and sensibles, for such are dianoetic objects, and those are mathematicals. Yeah, he's about to say that. Such are our soul and the theory pertaining to it, and also the mathematics, since mathematical forms have an essential subsistence in the soul. The soul is the hypostasis of mathematicals. For by being accustomed to energize immaterially, so for being accustomed to energize immaterially about these, so as our soul contemplates math and itself, we shall be able gradually to ascend to the contemplation of those intelligible forms which have their subsistence in deity, and which are the paradigms or models of everything that has a perpetual subsistence according to nature. And Plato says that in the Republic, we should have the guardians learn math so that they will be prepared to ultimately intuit the form of the ideal state, and that's how you can maintain the ideal state. Hence, Plotinus says that youth should be led through the mathematics in order that they may become accustomed to an incorporeal nature. And again, that Plato himself says that, but I'm sure Plotinus does as well. Footnote 7. The following beautiful account of the utility of the mathematical science is extracted from the commentaries of Proclus on Euclid. Page 6. Quote, Timaeus calls the knowledge of the mathematical disciplines the path of erudition because it has the same relation to the science of wholes and the first philosophy, which erudition has to virtue. Okay, interesting. So the knowledge of math is to the science of wholes and metaphysics as erudition is to virtue. So, all right. For the latter, prepares the soul by the possession of worthy manners to a perfect life. But the former enables our reasoning power and the eye of the soul to ascend from the obscurity of sensible information. So basically, just as a general education prepares someone to be virtuous, and that was basically the concept of paideia. You studied so that you could become a virtuous person, and clearly that's evident from the dialogues where all these sophists promise to teach people virtue. That's the number one thing. That's the object of education. But then the first philosophy in the science of wholes is the end of the mathematical disciplines. It's part of attaining virtue, but analogously, like education in general is to virtue, as the study of math is to its end, which is that highest kind of knowledge, metaphysical knowledge. Okay. Hence, Socrates in the Republic rightly observes that the eye of the soul, which is blinded and buried by other studies, is alone adapted to be resuscitated and excited by the mathematical disciplines, that by these it is again elevated to the contemplation of real beings, is transferred from images to realities, and from darkness to intellectual light, and in short is extended from a cavern and its detaining bonds and the fetters of matter to an incorporeal and impartible essence. For the beauty and order of the mathematical reasons, and the firmness and stability of the contemplation they afford, can join us with intelligibles themselves, and perfectly establish us in their essences, which are always adorned with divine beauty, perpetually remain the same, and preserve a mutual order without end. But Socrates, in the Phaedrus, delivers to us three characters who are elevated from a sensible to an intellectual life, and who, according to him, give completion to the primary life of this whole, viz., the philosopher, the lover, and the musician. The principle, however, and path of elevation to the lover is apparent from beauty, by employing, as steps in the ascent, the middle forms of beautiful objects. But to the musician, who is allotted the third rank, the transition is from sensible to unapparent harmony, and the reasons it contains, and to the one sight, but to the other hearing is the instrument of reminiscence. To him, however, who is naturally a philosopher, whence and by what means is the reminiscence of intellectual knowledge affected, and the excitation to real being and truth. So the lover has the technical instrument of aesthetics to elevate his soul. The musician has mundane harmony to elevate his soul. So what does the genuine philosopher have? For this character also, on account of its imperfection, requires a proper principle. It must be excited, therefore, from itself, and he who is naturally such is astonished by the contemplation of real being. So, metaphysics. And again, page 9 and mathematics is going to be training for metaphysical thought. And again, page 9, he observes that Plato clearly evinces that the mathematical sciences have a power of purifying and elevating the soul, removing, like the Homeric Minerva, Athena, the darkness of sense from the intellectual light of the Dianoetic power, which is better worth saving than 10,000 eyes, so that these disciplines not only partake of mercurial hermetic gifts, but also of those of Athena. we'll go ahead and start here. So we're still in seemingly the substance of Thomas Taylor's introduction to Aristotle's De Anima, and the footnote was just him cross-referencing things that he himself has said. I'd be curious to know whether the footnote was in the original introduction, but there we go. So that's it. Thank you guys for joining. Any thoughts on the reading today?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So we'll be moving on to Proclus on Timaeus next. Take care. Have a good one.